Hey, Public Interest Podcast listeners. This is Jordan Cooper, the host of Public Interest Podcast. And this week I'm trying something different. To date, I've recorded 251 episodes in the last 11 months since October 2016. And we've included Nobel Prize winners, cabinet secretaries, Pulitzer Prize winners, congressmen, senators. I spent the summer in Europe interviewing a few politicians and lots of local people, a lot of champions and public servants all around. And I found these stories to be incredibly exhilarating. But you know what? I understand I'm a little bit weird, and it's not everybody's idea of an amazing time to spend a half hour of their time listening to a retired politician or the executive director of a nonprofit. And though their work is incredibly meaningful and impactful, I understand that perhaps it could be more exciting if we were to infuse some emotion into it. So I wanted to experiment with changing up the format, and instead of it being a very serious one-on-one interview, I thought that I would speak to you directly using video and see if we could connect a little bit. So with this first kind of public interest podcast or PIP journal entry, I'll tell you a little bit about what I've been doing with the podcast, what I've been trying to do, and then I'll follow that with a few other video episodes with other individuals, co-hosts of mine, and see how it goes. So to start, so let's see here. I've been trying to, I started the podcast after I lost a 2014 Democratic primary election to represent District 16 in the Maryland House of Delegates, which includes Bethesda, Potomac, Friendship Heights, and Glen Echo. And I worked really hard in that campaign. And frankly, I've been preparing for it since I was a kid. I'm 32 years old now, but in 2003, I was 17, and I was a page in the Maryland House of Delegates. And that's when it first occurred to me that maybe I ought to try to become a state delegate at one point in the future. So I met a few delegates as a page, and then after college, I ended up working as a legislative aide for Delegate Keith Haynes, who still represents West Baltimore City in this Maryland House of Delegates. And I worked for him for a few years. I'm very proud that I've been doing public service since 1999, nearly every month of my life since that time, doing student service learning hour projects in high school, and then perpetuating that through my work when I was studying abroad. My junior year abroad, I was in Cape Town and South Africa and some other locations, but there I was able to teach tennis clinics to township kids from the area. Back in Poughkeepsie at Vassar, I was able to, on Fridays, go to Greenhaven Maximum Security Prison and volunteer in the prisons and just meet with guys who had been convicted for murder and armed robbery and just really get exposure to different people, different walks of life. And that was public service, and taught at some, volunteered at some middle schools and high schools. And then, after college, and while I was there, I was trying to be a professional tennis pro, and go figure, I wasn't good enough. But I did become a bench warmer for the Vassar varsity team and the University of Cape Town tennis team. And so fast forward, I was able to join a bunch of civic boards, and what else? Became an election judge, became the president of the Lux Manor Citizens Association, which represented 2,000 constituents in the Lux Manor neighborhood in North Bethesda, Maryland, and kept doing the whole public service thing, and volunteered on a dozen campaigns from 2010 through 2013. And in 2013, in December, I learned that Senator Brian Frosh was vacating his seat in order to run for Attorney General of Maryland. And I remember that day I was at Senator Victor Ramirez's fundraiser when I learned this in December 2013. I called my mom and dad. It was really cold outside. I was waiting for the bus because I commuted out from DC and didn't want to drive my car, so it was just easier to go straight public transit. It was a dark night, cold night, the end of December, and I said, Mom, Dad, I'm going to run for elected office. And also at that time, Delegate Bill Frick was vacating to run for the same Attorney General seat. That was being vacated by Attorney General Doug Gansler in his bid, which was ultimately unsuccessful, to win the Democratic nomination for governor for the state of Maryland. He lost to Anthony Brown the same day that I lost my bid for delegate. So I began an 18-month campaign. I knocked 12,000 doors. I ended up having 80,000 campaign volunteers working with me. I was nominated, and I've since sat for about 5 years on the Western Montgomery County Citizens Advisory Board. Since that time, I was elected chair of the Washington Suburban Sanitary Commission Customer Advisory Board, and then the White Flint Downtown Advisory Committee, the District 16 Democratic Club Board, the Montgomery County Democratic Central Committee, area coordinator for Area 16.2, and also on the Selective Service Board. Many people don't realize, but we actually still have a draft system in America, and every male citizen 18 and older should be registered for the draft, although the draft is limited to individuals between 18 and 26 once the U.S. Congress and the President have authorized a draft. But the system's still in place, and we get training about whether or not someone can qualify to be a conscientious objector. So lots of public service and whatnot. I was living in Baltimore, working for the delegate. I used to walk dogs at the Barks Animal Shelter near Federal Hill and Ravens Football Stadium. I used to usher at the theaters, the Hippodrome and the Everyman Theater, and about 7 different theaters up there. And I did that also in D.C. at the Keegan and another one on 14th Street, Studio Theater, I think. And of course, it's just because I'm poor, because I am passionate about public service. And being an usher is a great way to appreciate the arts without needing to pay a $40 or $60 fee for the ticket. So for me, one message that I try to convey is that, public service, and I hope this comes across through Public Interest Podcast, public service is not just self-laceration. It's not masochistic. It's not Mother Teresa putting her own life at risk to hold lepers and make them feel wanted and cared for. For me, I have a whole philosophy, an existential philosophy of life. And I'm an atheist, and even though I'm very Jewish, and I believe that absent man, so if humanity were to go extinct, there would be no meaning in the known universe. I believe that it's statistically quite probable that there are other intelligent life forms in the universe, and perhaps they have other sources of meaning. But for what we know now in 2017, I'd say that if all mankind were to die, if the sun were to explode in a red dwarf a few billion years from now, and man has never managed to colonize another planet by that point, and we were to all die, there would be no more meaning left in the universe. I think man is the source of meaning, and meaning is determined by that to which man has ascribed meaning. So what does that mean? Well, for instance, when I was about ages 15 through about 21, I'd play tennis anywhere from 3 to 6 hours a day on average, nearly 7 days a week, and I'd train very hard. And for me, hitting a little fuzzy yellow ball back and forth over the net on a concrete or a clay court was very meaningful. I think it's an inherently meaningless task, the game of tennis, but for me that was so meaningful. It allowed me to aspire to greatness, to meet my limitations and surpass them, and really learn discipline and a whole lot of, I guess, it improved my character to a great extent. And so that is no longer meaningful for me. I hardly play tennis at all, but at the time it was very meaningful. So given that man is a source of meaning, I've logically determined that the best way to go about having a meaningful life is to serve man, which in my opinion, man is the source of meaning. So the way to have the most meaningful and fulfilling life is to serve man. Also, the sense as I grow older that there's an inherent ephemerality to everything in life, and that Everything that once was will no longer be. I think as there's an old aphorism about a king asking all the men in his kingdom to come up with something that he could inscribe on the top of his throne that would always be true in the best of times and in the worst of times. And a wise man came up with the phrase, "This too shall pass." And the sense that everyone I ever know or ever could know or could ever impact or would ever be impacted by me in a few centuries' time, in the most generous possible interpretation of my life, would no longer be remembered. And that even the most powerful kings of yore and even the most powerful politicians of today are not well known by the majority of humanity. And some of the most powerful kings in the past are no longer known, let alone your average man, as I am. Lord Byron in the early 19th century wrote The Legend of Ozymandias, his poem essentially about going into the Sahara Desert and finding a statue of the legendary Ozymandias. And I'm pulling on my 12th grade AP English with, or maybe 11th grade with Dixie Baker at Walter Johnson, but essentially, says, oh, well, the statue, all the land before you and everything you can see belongs to him, Ozymandias. And of course, no one's ever heard of Ozymandias. It's just some statue that's 3/4 buried in sand in the middle of nowhere, and there's all desolation and nothing. And the fact is, this too shall pass. Everything that you can do will, in the long run, be of no importance to posterity way down the line. So really, I think if you want to have any meaning or impact, you ought to seek to maximize the quality and perhaps the quantity of your impact on people who are alive today, who can benefit from your life today. And I think that's the best that we can do. So in pursuing public service, for me, it's the logical conclusion of seeking to be part of something greater than myself so that I have a more fulfilling life, more meaningful life. And it's not purely driven by altruism, though I perceive a lot of altruistic motivations in my actions. I seek to have a life that's fun. I love politics. I love being involved in learning about the issues, even if they're boring. And frankly, talking about zoning laws or the way to construct pipes for a utility infrastructure, it's not the most exciting thing in the world. And as you see with other public interest podcast episodes, some of the stuff really gets technical and isn't the most exciting thing. So for me, but it was fun to walk the dogs at the animal shelter when I couldn't afford to have my own dog and I'd grown up with a dog. And look, I wanted to play with dogs and that was fun for me. And the fact is, if I hadn't done that, those dogs wouldn't have left their cages those days. So it was a good service, but it felt good, and it was something that was good for me. If I hadn't been able to usher at the show and collect tickets and pick up trash and whatever, then I wouldn't have been able to enjoy the theater. Mentoring a black kid in West Baltimore on West North Ave in a bad part of town, an indigent kid, he's a great kid. And I was just simply recognizing, look, it doesn't take so much for me to share some of what I've been given, which has been a whole lot in life, with somebody who's not being given as much. And it meant a lot to him, and it was interesting to see his quality of life. And so I taught him to drive on my car, but it wasn't really my car because it was given to me by my dad. So for me, it's a lot of logic. And so public service is about trying to do the best you can for others, but there's in my case, a decidedly self-interested bent to public service. I find it inspiring. I find it noble and honorable. And those are attributes that for me are quite worthwhile striving towards in life. And that's kind of why I've invested so much. I mean, it takes 45 minutes on average to prepare one single episode of Public Interest Podcast for your viewing pleasure. And of course, it's free for you to consume, which is why I'd love if you'd consider making a contribution at publicinterestpodcast.com to help me with this endeavor. I think collecting stories is incredibly important. Before I get on the podcast, just back to the political story. So I ran for office. I did the best job I could. I left my full-time paid job, and I was working full-time on the campaign. I left my place in D.C., an apartment, in order to move back in with my parents so that I could work full-time and not have to worry about rent, so that I could focus on the campaign. And so I had a great team. I worked really hard. I sent out 4 pieces of mail to tens of thousands of people who printed 140,000 pieces of literature. Was out at the metros and the grocery stores and knocking doors and making phone calls, and